Even if I slumbered in an ancient tomb unknown to mankind, growing a thick layer of mold over my deteriorated flesh, I still couldn't match the sheer decrepitude seeping through axe skill tooltips. I'm of course exaggerating for the sake of comedy, but that doesn't invalidate the pain-inducing truth that axes aged the poorest from all warriors' weapons, and are left hinging entirely on other weapons and utilities to squeeze at least a drop of usability from this poor excuse for a weapon. And that's not without a reason. Axes fall into the same pitfall strength did. They offer only damage, and no utility at all, so your failure or success is completely dependent on your utility skills or second weapon set. Each axe ability only does damage, or does damage and gives you a split second of a boon, which wouldn't be bad at all if any of these skills did anything noteworthy besides that. Eviscerate, for example, does damage, it is a short dash, but considering length of animation and the fact that his ability isn't affected by quickness, it is effectively worse Aura Slicer, which coincidentally also applies slow. What Eviscerate does to make up for it? It gives you one stack of might. Moving on. Cyclone Axe does three things. It deals damage, applies vulnerability, and gives you fury. This isn't anything to complain about, but nothing noteworthy either. And neither is Throw Axe, which makes you shock and disbelief, throw an axe at your foe, applying cripple and doing damage. Damage increases by 50% if target is below half health and by 100% if target is below quarter health. The execute is convenient and opens up a window for combos, but it isn't newsworthy either, considering base damage of the skill is less than stellar. Further, we met Dual Strike. 2 hits, lots of damage, a little bit of quickness. Nothing to talk about. And even further, Whirling Axe. You deal damage in an AoE around you for up to 3.5 seconds. Here again, damage is high, and that's it. You could mention increased movement speed it gives you, but 3 seconds of swiftness would end up an equivalent of that. You can quite probably already pinpoint where the issue is with axes. All of their skills are dedicated to damage and damage only, which turns out to be extremely polarizing. Axes rule PvE, as where your target is the size of Nebraska and moving slowly if at all, lack of mobility isn't an issue, while also having a person dedicated to vomiting heals and boons all over you while picking morons off the ground en masse means you don't need neither defensive utility nor brain to succeed as a DPS in far too many of the encounters. Henceforth, the quality of the design at hand is practically only measurable from perspective of competitive modes, and these really like to unveil the cracks. Of course, having damage is not a problem. Not having mobility, defensive utility nor lockdown is a problem. Eviscerate is a very bad gap closer. It is short, requires adrenaline to cast so it cannot be used to engage fresh into the fight, and the swing animation at the end of the dash forces you to stand still for a split second, potentially letting your opponent slip out of melee range. That wouldn't be an issue if axes had any other dash. Not a movement speed increase, a dash. Look at Dagger for example. You must understand that dashes, leaps, shadow steps and teleports can be gap closers, while swiftness and super speed alongside other present movement speed buffs cannot, because of movement speed cap. No matter what buffs you combine together, you can't move faster than 200% of your base running speed. The only way to exceed movement speed cap is with a movement ability. Warrior is in uncomfortable position when it comes to mobility. It can only access sensible uptime of swiftness from Warhorn, as only non-elite utility skill granting swiftness is balanced stance, and super speed access is just as awful if not worse. And as the class that is supposed to function as melee-focused brawler with close to no supplementary mobility, Warrior needs good, frequently available gap closers to stay aforementioned melee. In case of maces, no mobility is attached at all, while hammer and axes have noteworthy mobility only on burst skill, which means they design the debauchery of requiring a resource that's primarily gained by hitting a target to get to a position from which you can hit the target repeats over and over again, and in all cases you need to outsource mobility. Maces, however, do bring defensive utility, while both them and hammer bring sizable amounts of lockdown. So outsourcing your mobility to a utility skill or a different weapon comes with more dependable benefit, as you have at least some ways to keep your target from running away. In case of axes, there is no such way. The closest to lockdown you have is Cripple, which only tips space control in your favor if your enemy doesn't have his own Cripple, Chill or other keep away tool. And now on top of that, the case of defensive utility. What kind of defensive utility do axes provide? There is none. To add insult to injury, Thief's stolen skill that mimics Whirling Axe reflects projectiles, while doing almost the same amount of damage, while Warrior's Whirling Axe does not reflect projectiles. Why is Thief's version of the same skill objectively better? The only way you have to survive with axes is to one-shot your enemy before your enemy one-shots you. And sure, that is possible considering every button on your weapon does good to high damage, but you also are the melee guy with little to no mobility, so unless your opponent WM1s into you like a cretin and suffers a stroke mid-combat, you are the one more likely to get exploded. Having to outsource just the mobility, just the lockdown, or just the defenses is an ask that can be fulfilled, especially if weapon has one of these already covered, but axes have none of these. No noteworthy mobility, no lockdown, and no defenses. Axes have only damage. And therefore, dual-wielding axes is the dumbest thing you could possibly do for a PvP or World v World Warrior build, because every time you swap into dual axes, you effectively make yourself twice as much vulnerable to getting destroyed. Axes only work when you use them as damage supplement for utility-heavy build, like stance builds for example. Still, main hand axe can be run optimally only in pairing with pistol, as Gunstinger is faster dash than Eviscerate with the same distance traveled and grants Aegis, which sums up to be just enough utility to enable axe's damage output. Offhand axe can be run in tandem with any main hand that brings its own mobility, and henceforth sword axe pistol setup, or the same thing with dagger in place of sword, seems to be only logical way to run two axes in one build. And still it requires the defensive backload of stance build to enable and run successfully in decently high lobbies. Saving grace of an axe build is that their signature trait, Axe Mastery, is in discipline line, so you can still run defense discipline with whatever elite spec suits your tastes. But that's only an upside because 3 out of 5 Warriors core trait lines suck while 2 of them are mildly overpowered, so it's not actually an upside, it's a travesty with a crankshaft. In more human terms, having only damage and nothing else as a weapon for a class that desperately needs all forms of utility is a very unstable position to find yourself in. Only because you can match an axe with something utility or mobility focused, these are playable at all. However, as a damage supplement to otherwise utility-focused builds, they are serving their function well. Besides that, they unfortunately are a noob trap. Most people feel some primordial need to dual-wield axes, which I can only blame on lack of real-life experience in the matter. But that leads to juvenile wards having unfun experience because warrior without utility is called cannon fodder. Opposite to math, 2 negatives here don't make a positive, so unless you play PvE exclusively, keep your axes packed separately. Literally just putting the 2 in different weapon sets so you always have damage and utility on board already makes a noticeable difference. And with that jerk slice of painfully obvious wisdom, crapface out.